In the dim glow of a lantern-lit study deep in the heart of a sprawling Georgia plantation in 1847, Dr. Elias Hawthorne hunched over a leather-bound journal, his quill scratching furiously against the page. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant rain, but it was the weight of his own words that pressed heaviest on him. "Tonight," he wrote, "I have crossed a line from which there is no return. The serum courses through their veins now, mine and theirs alike. If this fails, it will consume us all." Outside, the cicadas hummed a relentless dirge, oblivious to the shadows lengthening across the fields where dozens of souls toiled under the moonless sky. But what Dr. Hawthorne had unleashed that night was no mere medical trial. It was a pact with madness, a forbidden experiment born of pseudoscience and unchecked power, designed to prove the superiority of one race over another. And in its wake, it would shatter lives, forge unlikely alliances, and etch a secret so profound into the soil that it lay buried for over a century, until a single unearthed vial whispered the truth. Before we dive deeper, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The Hawthorne plantation sprawled across the red clay hills of Middle Georgia like a living monument to ambition and cruelty. Established in the early 1800s by Elias's father, a stern cotton magnate named Jeremiah Hawthorne, it was a self-contained empire of white-columned mansions, overseers' cabins, and endless rows of cotton that stretched toward the horizon. By the 1840s, under Elias's reluctant inheritance, the estate enslaved, over 100 souls, their labor the unseen engine fueling the family's wealth. Elias, a man in his late 30s with sharp features and eyes that darted like a cornered animal, had returned from medical studies in Philadelphia not as a healer, but as a theorist, obsessed with the era's feverish debates on race and heredity. Phrenology, bloodlines, the so-called science of human classification, these were his obsessions, fed by the toxic brew of Southern ideology that painted enslavement as a natural order. Elias's experiment didn't begin with violence, but with deception. It started in the spring of 1847, when whispers of unrest rippled through the quarters. The enslaved community, a tapestry of families uprooted from Africa and the Caribbean, had long endured the plantation's rhythms. Dawn to dusk toil, auctions that tore siblings apart, and the ever-present threat of the whip for any sign of defiance. Among them was Mira, a resilient woman in her 20s, her hands calloused from years in the fields, who had borne 2 children under the shadow of coerced unions, a grim reality masked as plantation breeding to ensure a steady supply of labor. Mira's husband, Josiah, a skilled carpenter forced to build the very structures that confined them, had begun sharing hushed stories of freedom gleaned from passing traders. These tales ignited small sparks of hope, but Elias saw only chaos. To him, the growing murmurs were proof of inherent inferiority, a flaw that needed scientific correction. Drawing from discredited European theories and his own twisted logic, Elias devised what he called the Vitalis Protocol. It was a serum distilled from rare herbs, animal extracts, and untested chemicals smuggled from New Orleans apothecaries, intended to enhance the physical and mental capacities of the enslaved population. In his journals, later found charred but partially salvaged, he claimed it would make them docile yet productive, aligning their supposed traits with the white ideal. But the truth was darker. Elias tested it first on himself, injecting a diluted dose in secret, convinced it would grant him insights into the human soul. Delusions followed, visions of ancestral ghosts, a blurring of his own identity with those he sought to control. Yet he pressed on, selecting a small group from the quarters under the guise of a health initiative to combat a fictitious fever. The first recipients were Mira and Josiah, along with a dozen others, lured with promises of lighter duties and extra rations. In the plantation's infirmary, a squat brick building hidden behind the big house, Elias administered the serum orally, mixed into weak tea. "This will make you stronger," he lied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The effects were immediate and erratic. Some, like Josiah, suffered raging fevers and hallucinations, their bodies racked with what Elias dismissed as adjustment pains. Mira, pregnant again from another forced arrangement, felt a strange vitality at first, a fleeting surge that made the fields bearable. But it twisted into unrelenting nausea and visions of chains dissolving into rivers of blood. Whispers spread through the quarters. This was no medicine, but a curse from the white man's devilry. As summer deepened, the experiment spiraled. Reports from the overseers, loyal men like Harlan Tate, who profited from the plantation's output, spoke of increased productivity at first, with workers enduring longer hours without complaint. But beneath the surface, fractures formed. Children born in the following months exhibited odd traits: paler skin in some, unexplained resilience in others, fueling rumors of a white blood infusion. Elias documented it all in ciphered entries, his writing growing frantic. "The lines blur," he noted one night. "I see myself in their eyes and they in mine. What have I wrought?" The community, bound by fear and the code of survival, maintained a fragile silence. Elders like old Nan, who remembered the Middle Passage, warned against resistance, fearing reprisals that could doom entire families. Yet small acts of defiance emerged, hidden herbs to counter the serum's effects, songs sung low at night that encoded the growing dread. Official records from the county courthouse painted a sanitized picture. Tax ledgers showed booming yields. Marriage bonds for white families flourished, and Elias's name appeared in local medical societies as a progressive thinker. No mention of the protocol, of course. Those pages were burned in a suspicious fire in 1848, blamed on a careless stable boy. The silence was complicit, woven into the fabric of a society that profited from erasure. Neighbors turned blind eyes, lawyers drafted deeds that obscured ownership of human lives, and the church steeple in the nearby town preached divine sanction for it all. But in the quarters, the weight pressed heavier. Josiah, weakened by the serum, confided in Mira one twilight evening as they mended nets by the creek. "This poison, it's changing us from the inside," he murmured, his voice a threadbare whisper. "But it changes him too. I see it in his steps, unsteady like a drunkard's." By autumn, the backfire began in earnest. Elias, haunted by his own injections, started questioning the very premises of his work. Sleepless nights led to furtive readings of abolitionist pamphlets smuggled into his library, works by Quakers and escaped slaves that pierced his delusion. The serum, far from proving racial hierarchies, revealed their absurdity, shared suffering, intertwined fates. One worker, a young man named Theo, collapsed in the fields, his body marked by vestiges of strain that no ledger could hide. His death was ruled a natural passing, but Mira overheard the doctor's choked confession to his wife, Lydia, in the big house parlor. "I thought I could master them, but they've mastered me." Lydia, complicit in her silence, urged him to end it, but the pact was sealed. Participants sworn to secrecy under threat of sale to deeper southern hells. As the year waned, the plantation held its breath. The experiment's toll mounted unseen, miscarriages whispered about in the shadows, a surge in desertions that were really flights into the night. Elias retreated further into his study, his journals filling with regrets scrawled in code. The truth simmered, buried like roots beneath the cotton rows, waiting for a reckoning that would come not in his lifetime, but in ours. a revelation sparked by a descendant's dig into forgotten archives, unearthing vials and letters that flipped the script on history's villains. For in the end, what began as an insane bid for control became the unlikely seed of awakening, turning a slaveholder's doctor into the shadowed pioneer of anti-slavery science. But that story, and the lives it upended, unfolds layer by layer from here. Winter's chill crept into the hawthorn plantation like an uninvited spectre, frosting the cotton stalks that had yielded their harvest and leaving the fields barren under a leaden sky. By early 1848, the Vitalis Protocol had woven itself into the daily grind, its invisible threads pulling at the lives it touched. Dr. Elias Hawthorne moved through the quarters with a feigned assurance, his medical bag slung over one shoulder, but his steps faltered more often now, betraying the serum's lingering grip on his own body. What had begun as a calculated bid to affirm the era's poisonous doctrines of racial destiny was unraveling, thread by thread, exposing the fragility of the man who wielded the needle. In the big house, his wife Lydia paced the polished floors, her whispers to the housemaids laced with unease, though she never spoke the truth aloud. The plantation's facade of order held, but beneath it, the ground shifted, secrets taking root in the soil, destined to lie dormant for generations. Mira felt the changes most acutely in the quiet hours, when the overseer's horn had not yet sounded and the world was still. Her pregnancy advanced under the serum's shadow, a burden that twisted her dreams into labyrinths of shadowed figures reaching from the earth. Once, she had found solace in the rhythm of the fields, her mind wandering to half-remembered tales from her grandmother's lips, stories of rivers crossed in the dead of night, of freedoms snatched from chains. But now, vitality ebbed and flowed like a treacherous tide. Days blurred into surges of unnatural strength, allowing her to haul bowls that should have broken lesser backs, only for exhaustion to crash down like a storm, leaving her curled in the corner of her cabin, whispering prayers to ancestors she could scarcely recall. Josiah watched her with eyes hollowed by his own trials, the serum etching lines into his face that aged him beyond his years. "It's like fire in the blood," he confided one frost-bitten morning as they shared a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush. "Burns clean at first, then leaves ash where hope used to be." The community in the quarters navigated this new affliction with the quiet ingenuity born of survival. Old Nan, her back bowed by decades of unyielding labor, became an unofficial guardian of remedies. Roots dug from the creek banks, teas brewed from willow bark to dull the fevers that plagued the afflicted. She moved among the cabins at dusk, her voice a low murmur as she instructed the younger ones. "The white doctor's potion ain't no gift," she warned, her gnarled hands pressing poultices to fevered brows. "It's a chain finer than iron, meant to bind the spirit." Yet even Nan treaded carefully. The overseers patrolled more vigilantly now, Harlan Tate's whip cracking sharper at any sign of idleness. Tate, a broad-shouldered man with a ledger's precision, reported to Elias with clinical detachment, noting the improved endurance in his logs while ignoring the pallor that haunted the workers' faces. To him, and to the county's ledgers, the plantation thrived. Yields up, no uprisings, just the steady churn of profit from human endurance. Elias's journals captured the descent in fragmented bursts, pages filled with ink that bled like wounds. He had expanded the protocol subtly, administering diluted doses to a wider circle under the pretense of vaccinations against the winter's ague. But the backfire was evident in the mirrors he avoided. His own skin prickled with phantom itches, and nights brought visions of the quarter's faces merging with his own, a kaleidoscope of shared torment that mocked his theories. In Philadelphia's lecture halls, He had absorbed the era's pseudosciences, craniometry charts proclaiming innate hierarchies, blood purity as divine mandate. Back home, those ideas curdled into something personal, a desperate grasp at justifying the inheritance that chained him as much as it did them. Yet the serum, that alchemical folly, dissolved the boundaries he cherished. One entry, salvaged from the fire that would claim most, read, "The vital force unites us, not divides. Their resilience mocks my proofs. I see in their endurance the lie of separation." Whispers of the experiment seeped beyond the quarters, carried on the wind to the big house and the nearby town. Lydia Hawthorne, once a picture of Southern grace with her lace collars and composed smiles, began to unravel in private. She had married Elias for the security of the estate, turning a blind eye to the auctions in the yard, the separations that echoed like thunder. But now, hearing the muffled cries from the infirmary, she confronted him in the study one stormy evening. "This madness will destroy us," she hissed, her voice trembling as rain lashed the windows. "End it, Elias, before the neighbors sense something amiss." He stared at her, his eyes fever-bright, and for a moment the doctor in him flickered. The healer who had once dreamed of easing suffering, not engineering it. But the pact held. Participants like Mira and Josiah were bound by oaths extracted in the dead of night, promises of family sales to Louisiana's brutal sugar fields if they spoke. The silence extended like roots into the community at large. In the town square, where white families bartered cotton and shared sermons on Providence, the Hawthorns were pillars. Elias invited to debate agricultural innovations, his medical advancements praised in the local gazette. No inkling of the protocol tainted those pages. Instead, they lauded the plantation's prosperity, erasing the human cost with platitudes about benevolent stewardship. Lawyers in the county seat drafted documents that obscured the truth. Bills of sale worded to hide coerced arrangements, inheritance papers that perpetuated the cycle. Betrayal ran deep. A neighboring planter, once a confidant, had supplied the chemicals, his complicity sealed in a gentleman's handshake. And the church, with its resounding hymns, preached submission as salvation, silencing any murmurs of unrest that drifted from the fields. Yet persistence flickered in the shadows. Josiah, his carpenter's hands steady despite the serum's tremors, began etching symbols into the undersides of benches, crude maps inspired by those trader tales, guides for a possible flight. Mira, her belly swelling with the child conceived under duress, sang lullabies to her existing little ones that wove in warnings of the doctor's brew, preserving the knowledge orally as her forebears had across oceans. These acts, small and unseen, sowed seeds of resistance, a quiet faith that the truth would outlast the whips and the lies. As spring hinted at return, greening the edges of the fields, the toll mounted. A child in the quarters, born to one of the early recipients, arrived with eyes that held an uncanny clarity, speaking words before her time, traits Elias noted with a mix of horror and awe. "The experiment evolves beyond control," he scrawled, his quill shaking. The lines between oppressor and oppressed blurred further, forcing Elias toward a precipice. Doubts, once whispers, grew into a roar, drawing him to forbidden texts hidden in his library, narratives of the Underground Railroad, accounts from freed souls that humanized what he had dehumanized. The serum, meant to enforce division, was forging an unintended bridge, one that would in time transform the doctor from architect of cruelty to reluctant harbinger of change. But the unraveling was just beginning. Deeper fractures lay ahead as the protocol's echoes rippled through births and burials, binding fates in ways no ledger could record. The plantation's soil, soaked in unspoken suffering, held these stories close. their revelation deferred by decades of deliberate forgetting, until a modern hand disturbed the archives, pulling back the veil on a legacy of madness and redemption. Spring's tentative warmth seeped into the hawthorn plantation like a hesitant promise, coaxing green shoots from the red clay, but doing little to thaw the chill that had settled over the quarters. By mid-1848, the Vitalis Protocol had become an insidious undercurrent, its effects no longer confined to the initial subjects, but threading through the daily lives of the entire enslaved community. Dr. Elias Hawthorne, once the confident architect of this pseudo-scientific folly, now wandered the fields at odd hours, his medical coat dusted with soil, as if seeking absolution in the very earth that bore witness to his hubris. The serum, that volatile concoction meant to etch divisions into flesh and blood, was instead eroding the barriers he had so carefully constructed, revealing, in cruel irony, the shared fragility of all souls under the plantation's yoke. Whispers of unrest grew bolder in the shadows, carried on the breeze like pollen from forbidden flowers, hinting at fractures that no amount of official silence could mend. Mira's labor in the fields had shifted into a rhythm of endurance that bordered on the supernatural, her body responding to the serum's whims with bursts of strength that drew wary glances from her fellow workers. She hoed the soil with a vigor that turned heads, the handle of her tool steady, even as sweat beaded on her brow under the rising sun. Yet these moments of unnatural prowess came at a cost, nights when pain coiled in her abdomen like a serpent, threatening the life she carried. Her children, the two young ones who clung to her skirts, noticed the change. Their wide eyes followed her as she moved, sensing the shadow that the doctor's medicine had cast over their fragile world. Josiah, her steadfast partner through years of coerced arrangements and quiet defiance, bore his own scars from the protocol. The tremors in his hands, once subtle, now made fine work impossible. He hammered nails into barn siding with deliberate slowness, each strike a muffled protest against the fire that still simmered in his veins. "It's rewriting us," he told her one evening by the flickering light of a pine-knot torch, his voice low to evade the ears of patrolling overseers. "But in the rewriting, maybe we find a way to break free." The quarters, those clustered cabins of weathered pine that housed the plantation's human engine, pulsed with a subdued tension. Families gathered after dusk, sharing meager suppers around hearths that smoked like unspoken grievances. Old Nan's remedies circulated more freely now. Decoctions of sassafras and elderberry passed hand to hand, a clandestine network born of collective memory. She had seen experiments before, not in vials, but in the brutal improvements of overseers who sought to wring more from broken bodies. "This one's different," she murmured to a circle of women one moonless night, her voice weaving through the dark like smoke. "It touches the soul, not just the back, but souls remember even when papers burn." The elders enforced a code of discretion, knowing that overt rebellion could invite the auction block's merciless gavel, scattering kin like chaff in the wind. Yet subtle rebellions bloomed. Children taught to mimic the serum's effects in play, diluting its stigma through laughter. Songs adapted from African rhythms, their lyrics twisted to encode warnings about the white doctor's brew. These threads of persistence wove a tapestry of resilience, preserving truths that official histories would later attempt to unravel. Elias's internal torment deepened with each passing day, the serum's backlash manifesting in ways that isolated him further from the world he had inherited. In the big house, where crystal decanters gleamed on mahogany sideboards, he pored over his ciphered journals by candlelight, the flames dance mirroring the chaos in his mind. Visions plagued him, faces from the quarters overlaying his own in the looking-glass, a spectral reminder that the vital force he sought to manipulate bound them all in an inescapable web. What had started as a bid to validate the era's racial myths drawn from the tainted wells of phrenology and eugenic fantasy, now confronted him with their hollowness. He recalled lectures in Philadelphia, where professors droned on about cranial capacities and bloodlines as if they were immutable laws, ignoring the humanity that pulsed beneath. Back on the plantation, those theories crumbled under the weight of lived suffering. One afternoon, as he tended to a worker felled by serum-induced convulsions in the infirmary, Elias's hands shook, not from fear, but from a dawning recognition. "We are all vessels of the same storm," he whispered to the empty room, the words a betrayal of everything his father had instilled. Lydia's complicity frayed at the edges, her days filled with the hollow rituals of plantation life, overseeing the kitchen garden, hosting teas for neighboring wives who prattled about harvests and hymns. But the sounds from the quarters infiltrated her peace. A child's wail cut short, the rhythmic thud of labored breathing in the night. She confronted Elias again in the parlor, the air heavy with the scent of wilting magnolias from a vase on the mantel. "The town's talking of queer happenings," she said, her voice edged with accusation. "Productivity's up, they say, but at what price? End this folly before it stains us all." Elias met her gaze, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, and for the first time he voiced the fracture forming within. "It's not folly, it's revelation. The serum shows me the lie we've all lived." Lydia recoiled, her silence a wall rebuilt in an instant. But the seed of doubt had taken hold. She began slipping extra rations to the quarters under cover of charity, small acts that skirted the line of betrayal. The broader silence of the community and institutions enveloped the plantation like a shroud, meticulously crafted to preserve the status quo. In the county courthouse, dusty ledgers chronicled bountiful yields and routine transactions, bonds for white marriages, tallies of cotton bales, but omitted the human ledger of coerced endurance and hidden afflictions. Lawyers, those guardians of property, drafted clauses that veiled the protocol's existence, ensuring that any whispers of irregularity dissolved into legal fog. Neighboring planters, bound by shared interests, exchanged nods of approval at market days, praising Elias's innovations without probing deeper. The local gazette ran puff pieces on the Hawthorne estate's prosperity, framing it as a model of Southern ingenuity, while the church's Sunday sermons extolled divine order, urging submission as the path to salvation. This complicity, woven from profit and prejudice, buried the truth deeper than any grave, allowing the experiment's echoes to fade into the fabric of forgotten history. Yet in the face of this erasure, flickers of faith endured. Josiah and Mira, in stolen moments by the creek, plotted contingencies. Routes northward gleaned from coded songs. Allies among passing freemen. A young boy in the quarters, unaffected by the serum but wise beyond his years, began collecting shards of glass from the fields, fashioning them into talismans against the doctor's reach. These gestures, born of unyielding spirit, ensured that the story survived orally, passed like heirlooms through generations, even as official records sought to consign it to oblivion. As summer loomed, the protocol's repercussions intensified. Births in the quarters bearing marks that defied explanation. Children with an eerie vitality that both awed and terrified. Elias, teetering on the edge of transformation, delved deeper into contraband abolitionist writings. The serum's unintended gift, forcing him to confront the humanity he had denied. The plantation, once a bastion of control, now hummed with the potential for upheaval, its soil pregnant with secrets that would germinate long after the last cotton boll fell. But the full unraveling, with its cascades of loss and unlikely redemption, lay just beyond the horizon, deferred by decades of deliberate forgetting, only to resurface in archives dusted off by persistent hands in our time. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. Summer's relentless heat blanketed the hawthorn plantation in a stifling haze by late 1848, turning the air thick and oppressive, as if the very atmosphere conspired to smother secrets before they could surface. The cotton fields now ploughed under for the next planting lay fallow, but the Vitalist Protocol's insidious legacy bloomed unchecked, its tendrils reaching into every corner of the estate. Dr. Elias Hawthorne, gaunt and hollow-eyed from months of self-inflicted torment, patrolled the boundaries of his domain with a restless fervour, his once precise gait reduced to a shuffle that mirrored the uncertainty gnawing at his core. What had been conceived as a triumphant affirmation of racial pseudoscience, a serum to refine the enslaved into compliant ideals, had twisted into a mirror reflecting the absurdity of such divisions. Shared afflictions bound oppressor and oppressed in an unbreakable knot, forcing Elias to confront the human tapestry he had long sought to unravel. In the quarters, lives hung in precarious balance, their stories etched not in ink, but in the resilient pulse of survival, waiting for a distant echo to amplify them across the chasm of time. Mira's world narrowed to the cadence of her swelling form, the serum's volatile alchemy amplifying the strains of her condition into something almost mythic. She moved through the lighter duties assigned in her advanced pregnancy, tending the herb garden behind the big house, her fingers deft among the rosemary and sage. But even these offered no respite. Waves of disorientation swept over her, visions of ancestral spirits rising from the earth like mist, whispering of freedoms lost in the crossing. Her children, sensing the shift, clustered closer, their small hands tracing patterns in the dirt to mimic the strong medicine that made their mother both fierce and fragile. Josiah, ever her anchor, adapted his labors to shadow her path, repairing fences near the garden under the guise of necessity. The serum had dulled his once sharp reflexes, leaving him prone to lapses that drew Harlan Tate's suspicious glare, but it sharpened his resolve. "This fire in us," he murmured, during a rare shared lunch of cornbread scraps under a willow. "It's burning away the lies. One day, it'll light our way out." Their bond, forged in the fires of coerced unions and quiet endurance, became a bastion against the protocol's erosion, a testament to the unyielding spirit that no vial could extinguish. In the heart of the quarters, the community's fabric strained but held, woven from threads of collective memory and cautious solidarity. Gatherings after the overseer's rounds swelled with purpose, women sharing poultices that masked the serum's fevers, men murmuring plans encoded in work songs that echoed across the fields. Old Nan, her wisdom a lighthouse in the fog, gathered the afflicted in her cabin, where the air smelled of simmering roots and whispered histories. "The doctor's brew thinks to remake us," she intoned one sweltering evening, her voice steady as she distributed vials of her counter-elixir. "But blood remembers the old ways. Hold to that, and it can't touch your core." Younger voices joined the chorus, adapting African proverbs into tales of trickster spirits outwitting white folly, preserving the knowledge that would evade the flames of future cover-ups. Defiance manifested in subtle strokes, a hidden cache of the serum, pilfered from the infirmary and diluted into harmless sludge, children taught to feign its vigor to protect the vulnerable. These acts, born of faith in an enduring legacy, sowed the seeds of revelation, truths that would surface not in contemporary outcries, but in the unearthed fragments of diaries and bones, defying the institutional amnesia that sought to bury them. Elias's transformation accelerated under the summer sun, the serum's backlash stripping away layers of delusion to reveal a man adrift in moral wilderness. In his study, surrounded by shelves of forbidden volumes, smuggled narratives from the north, treatises on human equality that clashed with his upbringing, he scribbled confessions in ever more frantic cipher. The visions intensified, not just faces merging, but entire scenes of the Middle Passage overlaying his own privileged voyage from Philadelphia, blurring the lines of inheritance and guilt. He had inherited not just land, but a system of control that the protocol now exposed as a house of cards. During a midnight vigil in the infirmary, tending to a worker gripped by serum-spawned delirium, Elias felt the full weight of his complicity. "I sought to divide what nature unites," he wrote later, the page stained with what might have been tears or sweat. Doubts evolved into quiet actions. He began altering his reports to the overseers, downplaying the protocol's successes to shield the afflicted from further doses. In stolen hours, he pored over abolitionist letters, their words igniting a spark that the serum had unwittingly fanned, the recognition that true science lay in empathy, not hierarchy. Lydia's unease deepened into a chasm, her role as plantation mistress fracturing under the strain. She navigated social calls in the town with practiced poise, deflecting queries about the unusual vitality in the fields with tales of Elias's innovative farming. But alone, she rifled through his desk, glimpsing coded entries that hinted at the madness unfolding. One afternoon, as thunder rumbled on the horizon, she cornered him in the arbor, vines heavy with unripe grapes. "You're changing, Elias, losing yourself to this abomination," she accused, her voice cracking. He turned to her, his expression a mosaic of regret and resolve. "It's not loss, it's awakening. The serum proves it. We're all entangled in this web of suffering." For the first time, she glimpsed the shift, not toward ruin, but toward redemption. And in her silence, a tentative alliance formed, her small sabotages multiplying, rations augmented, patrols diverted with feigned illnesses. The veil of institutional silence thickened, a deliberate shroud over the plantation's underbelly. County records swelled with accolades for the Hawthorns, tax assessments boasting record outputs, legal filings that sanitized coerced labor as contractual necessity. Lawyers, entrenched in the elite's web, crafted documents to obscure any anomalies, ensuring the protocol vanished into the ether of unrecorded history. Neighboring estates mirrored the complicity, their owners trading in whispers of Elias's methods without condemnation, bound by the mutual safeguard of profit. The church, with its tolling bells calling the faithful to order, preached on the divine hierarchy, quelling any stray rumors that might unsettle the flock. This betrayal, systemic and sanctioned, entombed the truth deeper, allowing generations to inherit myths of benevolent progress, while the real narrative festered in oral traditions and hidden ledgers. Amid the erasure, persistence burned bright. Josiah and Mira, in the hush of twilight, etched escape routes into memory, their faith a quiet rebellion against the serum's chains. A birth in the quarters that month, a child with an inexplicable resilience, stirred awe, its cries a harbinger of the protocol's unintended legacy. Elias, witnessing it from afar, felt the precipice loom. The experiment, backfiring spectacularly, was propelling him toward an unthinkable path, one that would redefine his legacy from perpetrator to pioneer. As autumn approached, casting long shadows over the fields, the fractures widened. Losses mounted in secrecy, miscarriages veiled as natural woes, departures framed as wanderings, each a scar on the plantation's soul. The soil, witness to it all, cradled these tales, their emergence delayed by over a century, until modern inquiries peeled back the layers, revealing not just horror, but the fragile dawn of justice through one man's improbable awakening. Autumn's golden decay settled over the Hawthorn plantation, like a shroud woven from fading leaves and lengthening shadows, the air crisp with the scent of turned earth and impending frost. By October 1848, the Vitalis Protocol had metastasized into a silent epidemic, its repercussions etching invisible scars across the estate's expanse. Dr. Elias Hawthorne, a shadow of his former self, traversed the paths between the big house and the quarters with a haunted deliberation, his medical satchel heavy with unused vials that mocked his earlier zeal. The serum, that misguided elixir born from the era's toxic fusion of science and supremacy, had not fortified divisions, but dissolved them, compelling Elias to grapple with the profound interconnectedness of suffering. In the fields, where workers prepared the soil for winter's rest, lives teetered on the edge of endurance, their quiet fortitude a counterpoint to the institutional veils that would cloak this chapter in obscurity for generations. Mira's confinement brought a fragile interlude, her body a battleground, where the serum's remnants clashed with the natural rhythms of birth. She rested in the dim confines of her cabin, the walls papered with faded newsprint scavenged from the big house, while her children played outside under the watchful eyes of kin. The labor had come swiftly under a harvest moon, yielding a daughter whose cries pierced the night like a declaration of defiance. The infant, named Ilara by Mira in a whisper of half-remembered lore, bore subtle marks of the protocol, an unusual alertness in her gaze, a resilience that seemed to defy the frailty of newborn life. Mira held her close, nursing in the hush of pre-dawn, feeling the child's warmth as a fragile victory against the coerced legacy that had shaped her own path. "You've come through the fire," she murmured, her voice a thread of solace amid the ache that lingered in her limbs. Josiah, granted brief reprieves from his duties, sat vigil nearby, his hands, still prone to the serum's subtle quakes, carving a small wooden cradle from salvaged oak. The birth stirred a quiet hope in him, a sense that the poison might yield something unbroken, though fear shadowed every joy, knowing the overseer's scrutiny could twist even this into peril. The quarters thrummed with a subdued reverence in the wake of Ilara's arrival. Families converging in hushed clusters to offer tokens, dried herbs for the mother's strength, feathers from creekside birds for the child's protection. Old Nan presided over these gatherings like a matriarch of the unseen, her remedies evolving to include chants drawn from ancestral echoes, words that warded against the doctor's lingering influence. "Births like this one," she confided to Mira one chill evening, as stars pricked the velvet sky. "They're the ancestors pushing back." The brew tried to rewrite the blood, but blood writes its own story. The community, bound by years of shared burdens, from the auctions that sundered kin to the enforced pairings that perpetuated their numbers, channeled this event into a web of oral preservation. Songs adapted for the cradle wove in cautions about the serum's grasp, ensuring the knowledge endured beyond the plantation's confines. Subtle acts of resistance multiplied, workers slowing their pace just enough to evade Tate's lash, hiding effigies of Elias in the underbrush to mock his faltering authority. This persistence, rooted in an unshakable faith, formed the bedrock against erasure. Truths destined to resurface in fragmented diaries and whispered lineages long after the last witness faded. Elias's awakening deepened into a profound reckoning, the serum's unintended alchemy stripping away the veils of his inherited worldview. In the solitude of his study, where frost etched patterns on the window panes, he confronted the journals that chronicled his descent, pages dense with ciphers that now seemed like chains of his own making. The visions persisted, evolving from mere hauntings into clarion calls, scenes of the quarter's daily toil overlaying his childhood memories of privilege, revealing the plantation not as a throne, but a prison for all. He had returned from Philadelphia armed with the era's pseudo-scientific arsenal, treatises on heredity that justified bondage as biological fate, phrenological maps that reduced souls to skull measurements. Yet the protocol exposed their fraudulence. The shared convulsions it induced a brutal proof of universal humanity. One stormy afternoon, as wind howled through the eaves, Elias ventured into the quarters unannounced, his presence drawing wary stares. Kneeling beside a fevered elder, he administered a true antidote. Herbs sourced from Nan's hidden stores, procured through Lydia's covert aid. "Forgive what I've sown," he whispered, the words a fracture in his resolve, marking the pivot from experimenter to confessor. Lydia's transformation mirrored her husband's, her complicity yielding to a tentative empathy that reshaped her days. She moved through the big house with a newfound purpose, her embroidery needles idle as she orchestrated diversions, feigned ailments to pull overseers from their rounds, parcels of cloth smuggled to the quarters for winter's bite. The social whirl of autumn harvest balls in the town tested her facade. Amid clinking glasses and laughter over bountiful yields, she deflected praises of Elias's advances with vague smiles, her mind replaying the cries from Mira's labor. In a rare moment of candor, as leaves swirled in the yard, she joined him on the porch. "This path you're on, it scares me, but it feels right," she admitted, her hand brushing his in silent pact. Their alliance, born from the serum's corrosive truth, began to undermine the estate's foundations. Ledgers subtly altered to underreport productivity, hints of the protocol's perils seeded in anonymous notes to distant kin. The machinery of silence ground on, an unyielding force that entombed the unfolding drama in layers of denial. County archives swelled with sanitized triumphs, assessments hailing the Hawthorne yields as exemplary legal parchments that veiled coerced endurance as dutiful service. Lawyers, pillars of the elite order, wove clauses to obscure irregularities, their ink drying over any trace of the serum's shadow. Neighboring planters, gathered at crossroads taverns, toasted Elias's ingenuity without a whisper of doubt. Their complicity, a bulwark against scandal. The church's harvest festival sermons rang with themes of providential hierarchy, quelling murmurs from field hands who sought solace in the pews. This betrayal, institutional and intimate, ensured the story's interment, allowing myths of harmonious progress to flourish while the real narrative simmered in oral veins and buried relics. Yet faith's embers glowed undimmed. Josiah and Mira, cradling Ilara in the cabin's warmth, shared visions of a northward flight, roots mapped in the stars and songs. Other births followed, each a quiet testament to resilience, children who embodied the protocol's ironic legacy, vitality unbound by intended chains. Elias, witnessing these from afar, felt the inexorable pull toward action. The experiment's backfire, forging him into an improbable advocate, his science reborn in the light of shared humanity. As winter loomed once more, the plantation braced for convergence. Losses accumulated in secrecy, desertions veiled as vanishings, ailments dismissed as seasonal woes, each deepening the soil's hidden archive. The truths, deferred by decades of orchestrated forgetting, awaited their exhumation in modern vaults, where descendants and scholars would unearth the vials and voices, illuminating a legacy of tragedy and the faint, hard-won gleam of redemption. Winter's inexorable advance gripped the Hawthorne plantation in a vice of frost and silence by late 1848, the fields stripped bare and the wind carrying echoes of the year's unspoken tolls. Snow dusted the red clay paths like a thin veil over buried grief, muting the creak of cabins and the distant crack of axes splitting wood for meager fires. Dr. Elias Hawthorne, now a spectral figure adrift in his own domain, sought solace in the infirmary's dim confines, where shelves sagged under the weight of abandoned vials, the remnants of his Vitalis protocol, that pseudo-scientific delusion meant to etch eternal hierarchies into blood and bone. Instead, it had forged an unintended communion, binding him to the very souls he had sought to subjugate, unraveling the fabric of his convictions thread by thread. The plantation, once a bastion of unchallenged authority, now harbored fissures that widened with each frozen breath, secrets fermenting in the soil like roots defying the cold, their truths destined for a revelation, deferred by the relentless machinery of historical amnesia. Mira's days blurred into a haze of recovery and vigilance, Ilara's tiny form a living talisman against the serum's lingering shadows. She rose before dawn to tend the infant, her arms aching from the birth's ordeal, while her older children huddled close, their games tempered by the weight of watchful eyes. The protocol's echoes manifested in subtle ways, Ilara's grasp firmer than expected, her cries carrying a clarity that stirred unease among the elders. Mira felt it too, a faint undercurrent of vitality that both fortified and frightened her, a reminder of the coerced paths that had led to this life. In the quarter's communal yard, where women gathered to mend linens under the weak sun, she shared fragments of her experience, her voice low as thread through needle's eye. "It tried to steal our essence," she confided to a cluster of mothers, their faces etched with shared knowing, "but it gave us something fierce in return, a spark that won't dim." Josiah, laboring nearby on winter repairs, paused to listen, his serum-weakened hands steadying a beam as he nodded. The birth had deepened their resolve, turning private whispers into a quiet pact, to shield the child from further intrusion, mapping unseen paths to freedom in the constellations that pierced the night sky. The enslaved community, resilient as the oaks that bordered the estate, wove their endurance into the fabric of survival amid the deepening chill. Fires crackled in hearths patched with mud and moss, casting flickering light on faces marked by the year's trials. Fevers quelled by Nan's brews, labors lightened by unspoken alliances. Old Nan moved among them like a guardian spirit, her satchel brimming with winter tonics, bark infusions to counter the serum's chills, stories retold to instill courage. One evening, as sleet tapped the cabin roofs, she gathered the afflicted around her, her voice a steady rhythm against the storm. "This doctor's madness thinks to freeze us in place," she said, passing a steaming cup hand to hand. "But we've crossed colder waters than this. Remember the old crossings, and it'll pass." The tales evolved, incorporating the protocol's horrors into cautionary verses sung softly to children, ensuring the knowledge endured beyond the plantation's grasp. Acts of defiance, veiled in necessity, proliferated. Tools sharpened just enough to slow the overseer's patrols, rations portioned to favor the vulnerable. Harlan Tate, his reports to Elias growing terse, noted the seasonal lethargy, but turned a blind eye, his own ledger padded by the estate's output. This collective faith, a bulwark against despair, preserved the narrative in oral threads, truths that official erasures could not sever. Elias's metamorphosis crested in the isolation of his study, where frost-laced windows framed a world he no longer recognized as his dominion. The serum's backlash had evolved into a relentless introspection, visions now chronicling not just personal hauntings, but the plantation's collective agony. Overlaid images of auctions and fields merging with his father's stern lectures on inheritance. He had embraced the era's fallacies in youth, bloodlines as divine decree, racial essences quantified like cotton yields, all to justify the chains that bound the estate's prosperity. But the protocol's cruel mirror reflected their bankruptcy, the shared convulsions it wrought a testament to humanity's indivisible core. In a fevered night of writing, his cipher cracked under the pressure of truth, plain script emerging. The experiment has failed not in method, but in premise. We are one race, fractured by greed. He began systematic sabotage, vials emptied into the creek under cover of darkness, journals annotated with abolitionist insights gleaned from hidden correspondences. A clandestine meeting with Josiah, arranged through Lydia's signals, marked a turning point. In the infirmary's shadows, Elias offered genuine remedies, his voice breaking. "I've poisoned what I should have healed. Help me undo it." The carpenter's wary acceptance forged an improbable bridge, the first step in a redemption that would redefine the doctor's legacy. Lydia's evolution paralleled Elias's, her days a tapestry of calculated risks amid the big house's opulent chill. She orchestrated the household with a sharpened edge, meals augmented for the quarters, delivered via trusted hands. Elias's erratic moods masked as scholarly pursuits during town visits. The winter socials, with their roaring fires and toasts to Southern bounty, tested her resolve. Amid lace and finery, she parried questions about the plantation's enhanced vigor, with deflections laced with subtle warnings. Alone with Elias by the hearth one blustery night, she voiced the fear that bound them. "This path leads to ruin or freedom," she said, her fingers tracing the journal's spine. "But we've started. We can't turn back." Their partnership deepened, letters drafted in code to northern contacts, seeds of exposure planted in the snow. The institutional shroud tightened, a deliberate fog over the unfolding schism. County vaults brimmed with falsified prosperity, ledgers extolling yields untouched by human cost, deeds that perpetuated bondage under veils of legality. Lawyers, complicit architects of silence, buried anomalies in fine print, their services a shield for the elite's sins. Neighbors huddled in taverns against the cold, praised the hawthorn's stability without probing the whispers of odd births and vanishings. The church's Yuletide services rang with carols of divine favor, sermons reinforcing hierarchies that quelled any flicker of doubt. This betrayal, etched in ink and sermon, interred the protocol's saga, allowing sanitized histories to prevail while the real chronicle pulsed in forgotten songs and soil. Yet persistence illuminated the gloom. Mira and Josiah, with Ilara swaddled close, rehearsed escape signals in the cabin's warmth, their faith a defiant flame. Other families mirrored them, births and survivals weaving a legacy of unbroken spirit. Elias, from his precipice, glimpsed the horizon, the backfire complete, propelling him toward advocacy, his science reborn as a weapon against the chains he once upheld. As the year waned, the plantation held its breath amid mounting concealments, losses shrouded in winter's white, alliances forming in the dark. The ground, heavy with deferred truths, awaited spring's thaw and beyond, a century's silence broken only by persistent voices unearthing the vials and vows that birthed an anti-slavery dawn. If this story has already hooked you, leave a like. This helps Mira and Josiah's story reach more people. The first frail light of 1849 pierced the frost-laced windows of the hawthorn plantation, casting long shadows across a landscape forever altered by the invisible scars of the Vitalis Protocol. Dr. Elias Hawthorne stood at the edge of the quarters, his breath mingling with the mist rising from the frozen ground. As he watched figures stir in the dim cabins, souls whose lives he had unwittingly bound to his own in a web of shared affliction. The serum, that alchemical nightmare born from the era's fevered pseudosciences, had not imposed the hierarchies he envisioned, but shattered them, revealing the profound unity beneath the divides of power and prejudice. What began as an insane bid to prove racial destinies had backfired into a revelation that propelled Elias toward an abyss of conscience, transforming him from architect of control into a shadowed harbinger of change. Yet the plantation's soil, soaked in unspoken endurance, cradled these truths like dormant seeds, their germination deferred by generations of deliberate silence, only to bloom in the unearthing of our time. Mira cradled Ilara in the cabin's meager warmth, the infant's steady breaths a quiet defiance against the winter's bite and the protocol's lingering grasp. The child's eyes, bright with an uncanny awareness, seemed to hold echoes of the serum's volatile legacy, a resilience that mirrored Mira's own, forged in the fires of coerced endurance and quiet faith. Her older children played nearby, their laughter tempered by the hush of survival, as Josiah mended a leaking roof with hands that still betrayed faint tremors. The birth had marked a turning point, not just for their family, but for the quarters at large, where whispers of the doctor's shifting demeanor circulated like cautious winds. "He's breaking," Josiah murmured one dawn, his voice low as he shared a scrap of salted pork with Mira. "The poison he gave us is eating his soul too. Maybe that's our opening." Their bond, tempered by years of shadowed unions and stolen hopes, now extended to tentative plans, signals etched in the frost for a northward path, allies glimpsed in passing freemen. In these fragile moments, persistence bloomed, a faith that the ancestors' rivers would one day carry them beyond the chains. The community in the quarters, resilient as the evergreens that dotted the hills, navigated the season's hardships with a deepened solidarity. Fires burned low in hearths, casting glows on faces lined by the protocol's toll. Fevers dulled by Nan's persistent remedies, labors eased by unspoken pacts. Old Nan, her steps slowed but her spirit unbowed, became the keeper of the evolving narrative, gathering kin around her in the lengthening evenings to recount the saga in veiled verses. "The white man's brew sought to remake the blood," she intoned, her words weaving through the chill like threads of smoke. "But blood holds its own map, drawn in the stars and the soil. We'll carry it forward, even if the papers try to burn it away." Songs adapted for the cold nights encoded the serum's betrayals, lullabies that warned of its grasp while promising endurance. Subtle rebellions persisted, caches of true herbs hidden in hollow logs, paces slowed in the woodlots to foster rest. Harlan Tate's patrols grew erratic, his reports to Elias laced with unease, but the overseer's complicity held, bound by the estate's profits and the fear of unraveling the order he enforced. This collective memory, oral and unyielding, ensured the story's survival, a counterforce to the erasures that would cloak it for over a century. Elias's awakening reached its zenith in the solitude of his study, where the weight of revelation pressed like the snow outside. The serum's echoes in his veins, phantom fevers, visions of merged fates, had stripped away the illusions of his Philadelphia education, the craniological charts that quantified souls, the hereditary myths that sanctified bondage. In their place rose a stark truth, scrawled in his final uncoded entries. Science demands not domination, but recognition of our common frailty. The protocol has shown me the lie of separation. I must now speak against it. He began in shadows, vials destroyed in the creek's icy flow, journals sealed for a future that might understand. Through Lydia's covert channels, he dispatched coded missives to northern abolitionists, framing his insights as empirical proofs of equality, the serum's failures a testament to shared humanity. A clandestine pact with Josiah solidified, remedies distributed under nightfall, warnings of sales to brutal frontiers averted. Elias, once the plantation's unyielding master, now walked its paths as a man divided, his science reborn not as a tool of supremacy, but as the seed of liberation. Lydia's quiet rebellion intertwined with his, her days a mosaic of deception and daring amid the big house's fading grandeur. She navigated the winter's social eddies, teas where wives gossiped of harvests, balls where toasts rang to southern resilience, with a facade that masked her turmoil. Slipping abolitionist pamphlets into Elias's satchel, she orchestrated diversions, feigned outbreaks to halt patrols, parcels of wool for the quarter's warmth. In the hearth's glow one final eve, she confronted the precipice. "We've crossed into the light," she whispered, her hand steady on his. "But the cost, it will echo." Their alliance, forged in the protocol's crucible, undermined the estate from within. Ledgers fudged to reveal hidden strains, hints of the truth seeded in anonymous letters that would drift northward like whispers on the wind. The veil of complicity, woven by institutions and kin alike, shrouded the transformation in layers of denial. County archives, bulging with ledgers of prosperity, omitted the human fractures, yields tallied without the serum's shadow, deeds that perpetuated bondage under legal veils. Lawyers, guardians of the elite's secrets, drafted clauses to bury anomalies, their ink a barrier against scandal. Neighbors, insulated by shared fortunes, praised the Hawthorne's stewardship in crossroads murmurs, their betrayal a silent pact to preserve the hierarchy. The church's winter vespers echoed with hymns of divine order, sermons quelling any flicker of doubt from field hands seeking solace. This systemic erasure entombed the protocol's saga, allowing myths of benevolent progress to flourish unchecked, while the real chronicle festered in oral legacies and buried relics, awaiting voices bold enough to exhume it. Yet in the face of forgetting, faith endured like embers under ash. Mira and Josiah, with Ilara's first smiles lighting their path, etched freedom's blueprint in memory. Their persistence, a beacon for the quarters. Elias's improbable evolution, from experimenter to advocate, planted the roots of change, his insights circulating in abolitionist circles as veiled scientific endorsements of equality, influencing tracts that chipped at slavery's foundations long after his death in obscurity. The Hawthorne plantation faded into the mists of history, its fields repurposed through wars and reforms, the big house crumbling into vine-choked ruin by the early 1900s. Official records sanitized the era, tax rolls noting steady yields, no trace of the serum or its toll. Descendants of the enslaved carried the story orally, fragmented tales of the doctor's curse passed through sharecropping shacks and migrations northward, while Hawthorne kin buried journals in attics, complicit in the silence. Betrayal lingered in the soil, overseers' descendants profiting from erased lands, lawyers' firms enduring on forgotten deeds. But persistence prevailed. In the 1920s, a great-grandchild of Mira unearthed a charred journal fragment in a family Bible, its ciphers hinting at the protocol. Whispers grew in black churches and oral histories, fueling mid-century civil rights narratives. The revelation came tardily in 2018, when a historian in Atlanta, descendant of Josiah through a line that fled north in 1850, accessed digitized county vaults. A forgotten vial, unearthed during a state clearing in Middle Georgia, bore Elias's initials and residue matching period chemicals. Cross-referenced with salvaged journals from a Philadelphia archive, donated anonymously in 1865, the pieces aligned. The Vitalis Protocol, exposed as a backfired pseudoscience that birthed one man's anti-slavery awakening. Court filings from the 1840s, long buried, revealed hushed complaints of unnatural afflictions, while DNA traces in modern descendants showed anomalous markers, echoing the serum's ironic unity. Elias emerged not as villain alone, but as the era's first reluctant scientist to dismantle racial myths from within, his story a late justice for Mira, Josiah, and the silenced. Today, in 2024, the site stands as a memorial ground, plaques recounting the protocol's tragedy and resilience. The memory, once forgotten, now demands reckoning, elite's complicity laid bare, the enslaved's faith vindicated. In this unearthing, we honor the persistence that outlasted chains, a melancholic reminder that truth, though tardy, endures. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Hawthorne plantation. See you in the next video.